Hi everyone, welcome back to Join Clara for today's story that is absolutely insane. Imagine a war where missiles are flying, oil prices are exploding, world leaders are panicking, entire regions are on edge, and somehow the biggest winner might be the one country that did absolutely nothing. No missiles. No troops. No battlefield. Not even a warning shot. And yet, by the end of this conflict, China might walk away with the biggest prize. Sounds impossible? Well, that's exactly why today's story is so wild. Because this is not just about Iran, Israel, or the United States. It is about how, in global politics, sometimes the smartest player is not the one throwing punches. It's the one standing in the corner, smiling, while everyone else exhausts themselves. And honestly, that might be exactly what China is doing right now. So today, let's talk about this China and Iran war scenario, and more importantly, why China didn't fire a single shot, yet somehow might end up as the biggest winner. The irony is almost unbelievable, but here's the first thing most people get wrong. In war, the winner is not always the one launching the most missiles. Sometimes the real winner is the guy sitting quietly by the river, fishing, while everyone else is bleeding money, burning resources, and grabbing headlines. While the world is staring at explosions in the Middle East, someone else may be quietly collecting the real prize behind the scenes. And that country is China. Now, at first, this sounds completely backwards. China depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy. It is the world's largest importer of crude oil. A huge amount of oil from the region, especially from Iran, flows straight into China. So logically, a regional war should be terrible news for Beijing. In fact, it should be a nightmare. The Strait of Hormuz sits right between Iran and the Gulf states, and about 1/5 of the world's oil passes through that narrow choke point every single day. 1/5. That's ridiculous. So when conflict disrupts shipping, oil prices shoot up globally, and major importers like China, Japan, and South Korea should be the first ones sweating. But here's where the story takes a turn. Geopolitics is never that simple. Because what looks like a crisis on the surface can sometimes become the perfect strategic opportunity beneath the surface. And this war may be handing China exactly that. Economically, militarily, diplomatically, possibly even reshaping the global balance more in Beijing's favor. But to understand why, you cannot just look at the battlefield. You have to zoom all the way out. It is a chessboard. And the first move is distraction. The United States is distracted. Again. And honestly, this may be the most important part of the whole story. For China, the biggest immediate advantage is not cheap oil. It's American attention. Over the past 2 decades, the US has repeatedly been dragged into overseas conflicts. Iraq. Afghanistan. Years of military spending. Years of strategic focus. And while Washington was busy putting out fires, China used that exact window to grow. Its economy expanded. Infrastructure exploded. Military modernization accelerated. Many analysts call that period China's golden 20 years. And now, history may be repeating itself. If the US gets pulled into a prolonged confrontation with Iran, massive military resources have to shift toward the Middle East. Aircraft carriers, surveillance systems, missile defense, logistics, intelligence. None of these can be everywhere at once. And this is where it gets almost satirical. China no longer seems overly worried about US carriers sitting near its doorstep. But every Patriot missile battery moved away from South Korea or Japan to the Middle East means one less layer protecting America's allies in Asia. And psychologically, that hits hard. America's allies begin to feel exposed. Sometimes fear itself is a weapon. And it's not just hardware. It's attention. Presidents, diplomats, and military planners can only focus on so many crises at once. A Middle East conflict consumes enormous strategic bandwidth. And for China, that is almost the perfect gift. Trump originally thought he could wrap up the Iran deal in 2 weeks, and then head to Beijing to pressure Xi Jinping. That did not exactly go according to plan. Instead, the visit had to be suspended. And the irony almost writes itself. Not getting even a second-hand Nobel Peace Prize had already made him the punchline of the year. Then the Iran dilemma landed on top of it. Meanwhile, Beijing appears to be getting a bargain. Suddenly, Trump is no longer loudly talking about Taiwan arms sales. U.S. destroyers seem less interested in conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. And that matters. Because China's real priorities are right on its doorstep. The South China Sea. The Taiwan Strait. The Asia-Pacific. That's where Beijing wants to reshape the balance of power. If Washington is tied down in the Middle East, China gets more room to operate in its own backyard. Some Chinese strategists describe this with an old saying. Sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. Two tigers battle. One loses an ear. The other loses a tail. Then the observer decides when to move. Brutal. Cold. Efficient. There's even an old story about Bian Zhuang, who waited for two tigers to fight before attacking them. But here's the funny part. China doesn't even need to attack. It just needs the US to stay distracted long enough. Now let's talk oil, because this part is actually genius. Many people assume China would be caught completely off guard by an energy shock. But Beijing has been preparing for this for years. Over the last 2 decades, Chinese leaders have been deeply aware of the country's vulnerability to energy disruptions. Most imported oil passes through choke points that China doesn't control. The Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Malacca. Places that can be squeezed during a crisis. So China spent years reducing that risk. Massive strategic petroleum reserves were built. Basically, giant emergency stockpiles. If imports are disrupted, they can release oil into the domestic market. Some estimates suggest these reserves cover several months of imports. That buys time. And here comes another ironic twist. Because of Western sanctions, China often buys Iranian oil at a discount. Sometimes even settled in Yuan. Which, let's be honest, is a pretty sweet deal. Same with Russian oil. Discounted again. Almost as if geopolitical sanctions accidentally handed Beijing a loyalty coupon. China also diversified supply routes. Pipelines from Russia and Central Asia transport oil and gas overland. Less dependence on sea routes. Less wartime risk. At the same time, China dominates solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. Its cities are rapidly replacing gasoline cars with EVs. And yes, coal still plays a huge role. Not exactly environmentally glamorous, but it gives China more domestic energy independence. So yes, oil shocks still hurt. But compared with many economies, China may be better prepared. And in crisis, preparation is power. Then come alliances. War has a strange way of rearranging friendships. Countries under pressure lean harder on whoever still answers the phone. Iran is the perfect example. For years, Tehran has faced heavy sanctions. And who keeps doing business? China. Chinese companies continue buying large amounts of Iranian oil, often through indirect channels outside Western financial systems. That makes Beijing a critical economic lifeline. Which means leverage. If war further isolates Iran, Tehran may rely even more heavily on China for trade, financing, and diplomatic support. And the framework is already there. Back in 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year cooperation agreement covering energy, transportation, telecom, and industrial development. So if Iran emerges damaged but stable, China could help rebuild major sectors. And in return, gain an even stronger strategic foothold. And this is where the efficiency becomes almost absurd. China stays out of the fight. No troops. No direct involvement. No trillion-dollar wars. Meanwhile, it still benefits from the shifting balance of power. The US spends hundreds of billions on defense and global deployments. China can spend far less and still gain from the consequences. That's geopolitical efficiency at its finest. But the military side gets even more interesting. Because China is not just watching. It's learning. This conflict is basically a live broadcast of modern warfare. Every drone strike. Every missile interception. Every air defense engagement. All of it generates priceless real-world combat data. Chinese military planners study this extremely closely. Missile defense. Electronic warfare. Naval operations. It is a front-row masterclass. China doesn't need to fight to learn from the war. In a strangely ironic way, Washington may once again be providing Beijing with valuable lessons free of charge. Then comes the financial angle. It is long-term but potentially huge. For decades, the global oil trade has been dominated by the US dollar. But China has been trying to weaken that system. Iran has already pushed oil trade into alternative currencies, especially the yuan. If geopolitical tensions drive more energy trade outside the dollar system, China gains financial influence. And these shifts often begin during periods of turmoil. Then there's the most important factor of all. Time. Short wars don't usually transform the global order. Long wars absolutely do. If this drags on, the strain on US resources grows. Deployments become more expensive. Domestic political divisions deepen. Objectives get blurrier. Meanwhile, China stays focused on economic growth, technology, and military modernization. Steady. Patient. Relentless. History is full of examples where great powers weakened themselves through prolonged wars while rivals quietly grew stronger. Chinese leaders know this pattern very well. Of course, there are still risks. China remains heavily dependent on imported oil. A major disruption still hurts. Middle East instability also threatens Belt and Road investments. Ports. Railways. Industrial parks. Telecom infrastructure. All of that can be affected. So officially, Beijing continues to emphasize peace and diplomacy. But even if there is short-term economic pain, the broader geopolitical consequences may still tilt in its favor. Because in great power competition, victory does not always come from fighting. Sometimes the biggest gains come from patience. And now we arrive at the final irony. Donald Trump openly confessed that he is finger-lickingly hungry for Iran's oil. Yet strikes and sanctions may still leave him empty-handed. Meanwhile, Beijing could end up with not only Iran's oil, but also Iran's friendship without firing a single shot. That is why Xi Jinping can still smile. Donald Trump may need to summon spiritual experts to soothe his wounded soul. At this point, one monk or two priests are probably nowhere near enough. And honestly, that may be the most satirical ending of all.
He needs to lead our great nation as we come back to one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We pray your heavenly blessing upon him in Jesus' name. Amen.